Hey, this is John Lee Dumas, the founder and host of Entrepreneurs on Fire. And if you're wanting to learn how to embrace change and navigate through disruption as a leader, then listen to the Leadership is Changing podcast with my good friend, Denis Gianoutsos. He's prepared to ignite.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos.
Thanks for having me on. I'm a huge fan of the show and love getting to listen to your perspectives on leadership. It's always exciting to listen to.
Thank you. And Eric, whereabouts are you based?
So I'm in Henderson, Nevada now. I've always been on the West Coast. So I grew up in Southern California, but I've been here for the last 6 months or so.
Okay. And your name, Eric Skwarczynski, where does that originate from?
Polish. So yeah, it's Polish. I don't know anybody from Poland. I feel like I'm 2 or 3 generations away. So unfortunately, I don't know much about my heritage in that direction, but I know enough to know when people ask the common question, where's your name from? It's Polish.
Yeah. And fascinating work that you're doing, especially with the 8 mini-series that you've done and the documentary, I should say, and then also your latest podcast. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, like I said, I'm something, I guess I could be described as a storyteller. And from the time I was a little kid, 6, 7 years old, me and my friend would always make movies, quote unquote, with his dad's VHS camera. And so that was my initial experience that was my playtime, was making movies, making content, and went from that to going to digital and tapes and little mini discs, and now to DSLRs and things like that. And yeah, the 2 parts of me that have always come together is I have a big desire to help people and and I'll get into that a little bit, but desire to help as many people as I can. And I also love storytelling. And so being able to apply my work into helping nonprofits or helping individuals have better lives or to tell stories that I'm passionate about, those 2 things have always meshed really well. So,
And I know that a lot of leaders today are very successful because they've been very good at storytelling. And
Right.
I think that's a lot about being able to connect with the audience and take them on that, which is really good to see. So here's a question. Have you been in leadership roles, and how did you get into leadership roles? Have you been exposed to leadership roles?
So when you sent the questions, and it's funny because like when you asked me to come on the podcast, my initial thought was, I'm not really a leader. And when I told my wife that, she was like, you have a podcast with like hundreds and thousands of people following and listening to direction and like moving in a certain spot. And I was like, I guess technically I am a leader, but yeah, throughout my time, I've spent a lot of time on the solopreneur world, but I've definitely in the last 2 or 3 years have definitely moved into more team positions. And so I've gotten to work under people, over people, with people. And it's just, for me, I think it comes from what you said in the beginning of the show. It's stories that inspire real change. And so I think when you're passionate about telling a story and when you're vocal about a cause, there's going to be like-minded voices that kind of rally around you. And you're going to have people that want to work with you to help you get that cause out. You're going to find people as mentors who you can work under. And so leadership, I think, when leadership fails is when people try to push themselves into a position versus allowing a position to come from what they're already passionate about, or finding
Nice.
someone who's passionate about it and is making progress.
Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, beautiful. And I think that it was quite interesting how you're saying about, I don't see myself as a leader. There's 200 something thousand people who downloaded your episode.
Right.
And so you become, I think it's not the titles, it's an influence. It's
Right.
being able to influence people as well, which is really important. And I think, as you say, it's about that position and then allowing it to come out, which is really interesting. Here's an interesting question for you. Now, I'm sure you may have several. Who's your favorite leader? Now, this person could be alive or could be from history. Who's your favorite leader and why?
So my answer is non-traditional, but the person that comes to mind whenever I talk about influence or who shaped the way I think about just life and career and things is a filmmaker from Pittsburgh named George Romero. And it's perfect timing because it's Halloween season, but he directed Night of the Living Dead, which is like a very famous film and was very progressive at its time because it had a Black protagonist. But what I love about George Romero is he was not a Hollywood filmmaker. He was a Pittsburgh filmmaker. And he made these movies out of his hometown with his friends and would create these incredible movies that became world renowned for the messages they had, the stories that they told. A guy from Pittsburgh making a movie that a Stephen King watches and says it scared him and made him feel like he was a bowl of jelly. That kind of stuff's great. But even beyond just his like filmmaking prowess, there's two things that I really appreciate. Is one, he always had the things he was passionate about. So political views, social issues, they naturally flowed into his work. And when he made Night of the Living Dead with a Black protagonist, people were like, "Oh, did you mean to tell this huge message and create this?" And he said, "No, he was the best actor of all of our friends." And I like the fact that he wasn't trying to be this faux progressive and push things forward. It was a natural outpouring of what he was already passionate about and cared about and the way he lived. And the next part of that kind of ties in, but I really love that even though he had small budgets and not the resources of, say, a Spielberg or somebody, he had people that would always follow him from project to project because they believed in what he was doing. And so I'm constantly thinking about Romero. And that's someone, even in high school, like reading books about him and listening to interviews, it was amazing to me that somebody who didn't have the quote unquote leg up built this massive kind of movement of people just because he was a good person with a definite vision.
Awesome. Yeah,
So,
and I think you're right. People following him from project to project more because of the fact that they believe in him and they believe in what he's doing. I think it's really cool. And I could relate to the story because this part of the world in New Zealand, we had a guy who used to do films and it was real budget and used to do it in the backyard or on the farm and bare feet and so forth. And then, hello, Peter Jackson, Lord of the
right.
Rings. Yeah, it's massive, right? And so
Yeah.
it's really interesting how we also look at ourselves thinking, you said before, from Pittsburgh and this guy and he's doing these films and then Stephen King says his comment. We think the same as well about Peter Jackson. He's a guy.
Right.
So it's amazing how for a lot of us, we think that we're in a situation whereby can we actually get into that global stage? Can we actually go and do something bigger? Are we going to be worthy to do it bigger? Or
Right.
for some people come that imposter syndrome too. But it's really interesting how people do go and do it. But it comes down to the one thing I think you said, which is the passion, right? That's that
Right.
passion and that excitement. If they can share that with others, I think that's great.
Yeah. No, definitely. And it can happen both ways too. I grew up in California, so I was
Yeah.
poised to be this. Like it's a joke, like I'm a videographer from California. I had the opposite. And we always let our location or some other excuse say we can't do something. For me, it was there's already too many videographers. There's already too many podcasters. There's too many people that are successful in California. I'd have a better shot if I was in a Pittsburgh where there's nobody else doing what I'm doing. But yeah, it's important not to let that imposter syndrome creep in.
Yeah, I've always been a bit of a geek, Dennis, and I started out pursuing a career in computer science. But like many other females at the time, I dropped out of IT because it was far too technical and not really based in the real world. And I didn't really relate to the guys in hoodies in the lab. And so got a degree in marketing and quantitative analysis instead. But I couldn't really help myself though. And my whole career has ended up being in technology. And tend to migrate to where you really feel passionate. I came to New Zealand and started with a company called the Gallagher Group, who are basically an international success story in electric fencing. And I remember my first day, I walked into the foyer and I was looking at the pictures on the wall as you do, and there's a picture of a horse. And Bill Gallagher, who was the owner of the company, came up behind me, which was interesting talking to this guy who's saying, "Yeah, that's Joe the horse. He's the reason we're a company today." Kept sitting on the family car, and we had to come up with a way to get him to stay off of it. And he had that glint in his eye. And I guess I got a taste of what it meant to think creatively about solving problems. And yeah, and that really set me off on a very creative thinking, innovative career. And more recently at Fonterra, we were developing solutions for the dairy sector. And I think what's really important is we tend to think of technology as just solving small problems and getting on computer and digitizing things. But really, it's about how do we compete on a global scale. And New Zealand's dairy farmers aren't really just competing against themselves anymore. They're competing against the floating farms of Rotterdam, which are totally digitized. And we really can't compete with a paper notebook anymore. And so how do we actually lift the capability of our whole dairy sector? So at the moment, I'm also working on a project, looking to help small businesses lift their capability in the digital space for the same reason. Like, how do we actually really create that capability in our businesses? Yeah, and I am Canadian, but I've spent most of my career in New Zealand, and I do get a real buzz of seeing us create solutions that you really wouldn't expect to come out of a small island in the South Pacific. And like the All Blacks, if Kiwis believe they're the best, to forget the odds and just go out and do it.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic thing that, as you say, a lot of Kiwis do that and go out onto that global stage and punch above their weight, which is fantastic. I was wondering when you said Canada, because you said before that when you came to New Zealand or to Auckland, I was thinking, oh, where should come from? So how long ago did you move from Canada to New Zealand?
Many years ago, Dennis.
Just a while ago, yeah.
Yeah, so I arrived in the early 90s and
Uh-huh.
yeah, a really interesting time in New Zealand. Came as a backpacker and met a Kiwi, and I'm still here today.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Excellent. Hey, so what I got for you is some questions that I'm going to ask you as I ask my guests. And the question I've got for you is, how did you get into leadership?
It's been a bit of a go-getter, and I started probably early on in my career when I was promoted, probably within the first year of being at Gallagher's. And it was an interesting situation because all of my peers were now people who were reporting to me. And I guess I had to re-earn their respect. So people who, why should they treat me as a leader? Or I was their manager. You don't want to just be a manager. You still really want to make an impact. I earned their trust and learned to bring something different to the table. And I think that's where I really started enjoying that whole leadership conversation. I had to bring something different. At the same time, I couldn't be a jerk and put myself ahead of where they were. Some of them knew a lot more than I did. And I had to recognize that and also figure out how we would work together to get the best out of things. I had my role to play and they had theirs. And probably taught me really early on the importance of staying connected at a grassroots level and also not being afraid of surrounding yourself with people who are smarter than you. That's always been something I've challenged myself with. And I've worked with some of the, smartest techies around that, have taught me things, and whether that's from a technical or leadership perspective. And I think it's something we should challenge ourselves as leaders. As leadership is changing, how do we actually tap into some of the smartest minds in the room?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because some people actually feel threatened by smarter minds. And I think what you just said there is a successful leader will be very smart in actually making sure that they engage those people and allow them to fly and do what they do really well and bring their A game and enable that.
Absolutely.
And you do learn from it, right? So I think it's a good thing. And I like what you're saying about staying connected at the grassroots level, which is really good. So, Evelyn, you mentioned something before about competing on a global stage. So, what's one or two things that you think that people should do as a leader to lead on a global stage?
I think the key thing is not being afraid to really put your ideas out there. I think we all feel like we don't have something to say, and whether that's imposter syndrome or just thinking others are smarter than us. The more creative ideas that are out there, the more opportunity there is for them to come to life. And I think as leaders, it's almost an obligation or a responsibility to step up and put ideas out there.
Yeah, excellent. So, team, don't be afraid, be bold, have the courage to actually put your ideas out there and stand up and do that.
Hmm.
See where it goes. Who knows where it's going to go? So, Evelyn, I'm sure you've got many, but I'm going to actually ask you, who is your favorite leader? Now, this person can be alive or from history. So, who's your one favorite leader and why?
In the tech space, there are so many innovative leaders. So I think this is a very tough question, Dennis. But if I'm going to pick one, it would have to be Melinda Gates.
Mm,
Her and Bill's foundation have done in eradicating polio, and the approach they took using data. They completely modeled the world and looked at where they needed to be. And it was simply extraordinary. But I think Melinda Gates, she's also, a real role model for females in technology, which was really important for me. And I had the good fortune of hearing her speak live once, and I really related to a story she told about working in a male-dominated IT team in the late 80s, early 90s, and how she tried to be like the males in the room in her approach to leadership. And it just wasn't her. And so she decided to be herself and take an empathetic, more inclusive style to leadership. And she just really absolutely took off from there, and everyone wanted to be part of her team. And I think it's a really bold move to tap into your own personal leadership style and what works for you. And she's also incredibly committed to increasing diversity in technology. We're coming to an age in artificial intelligence where we are setting the stage for how technology is going to work for us for time to come, that's for sure. And we run at a risk of it being really heavily biased if it's only going to be coded by a slither of the population. So she's really focused on how do we think about different ways of attracting people into technology? How do we get them to learn differently? And how do we actually find them? And yeah, so I just think she's a real genuine person and a real role model. And she was definitely a role model for me.
I'm a Waikato boy. I studied in Hamilton before I moved to Auckland to advance my career. Originally I was a science guy by training, but I quickly discovered my passion for business when I moved into my first sales role when I was 22. And it's then that I found engaging with people was my true passion and skill. That kind of led me through a range of leadership roles over the years in New Zealand and Australia, and working around Asia Pac in all sorts of different roles. So yeah, it's been quite a journey from those early days in Hamilton.
Yeah, I bet. And tell me, how did you get into leadership?
Well, I got my first sales manager's job in my early 20s, and I just went from there. It seemed to grow organically. Every couple of years, something more got added. And it's over the years, it's been funny as I've had grads or people just getting started in their careers come to me and say, how do I get ahead? What's the secret? And my usual response to those people is, you've got to smash the role you're in. You really got to do a great job of what you're doing and then broaden it. But don't be afraid once you've earned that to ask for more responsibility and show that you're capable of growing. I firmly believe you need to earn opportunities, but it all starts with doing a great job of what you're already responsible for.
Yeah, nothing like delivering well and executing on what you're actually going to say you're going to do.
Yeah.
And as you say, smash it and knock it out of the ballpark, as we say another way of saying it. And if you do that, then your reputation, your brand, all of that gets a lot better, and people start to think about, wow, what can this person do for us? Which is fantastic, right?
It's funny how that just seems to happen. People say, oh, I got lucky. And I'm a big believer that you make your luck, you create luck, and you do the right things, and you'll get noticed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you'll also get noticed if you don't do things well either, but you want to get noticed for the right things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Hey, look, you may have many of these, but I just want to ask you, who's your favorite leader? And this person could be alive or from history. So who's your favorite leader and why?
Because I like telling stories, I think that's a great attribute of a leader. I've always admired Steve Jobs. I think the way he tells stories, the way he was quite a visionary. Many have read his books written about him. He may not have been perfect, that's for sure, but he certainly took Apple and all of us to a place that none of us could have imagined. So just his ability to captivate us and tell a story. And I talk a lot to people these days about pitching and presentations and things. And I still think that launch of if anyone wants to ever know anything about how to do a presentation, just watch the launch of the first ever iPhone. I think that was pretty incredible. So yeah, he's someone I've always admired.
Okay, and tell us a little bit more about the storytelling. Why is that important for us doing storytelling or using storytelling and probably actually doing it very well? Why is that important?
Yeah, it's the eraser. I talk a lot about that with my clients because people are used to talking about communication. What's your communication strategy? And I encourage people in the sustainability world, especially, to think about telling stories, because that's how you build engagement for me. And building, it's so critical in all leadership roles, but particularly in the sustainability world where you're trying to bring groups of stakeholders along with you, that you can tell a story that engages people's imaginations and helps them understand what they can do or what you're doing and be persuasive about the story you're telling. And it doesn't have to be, this is one of the, I think the mistakes some people make, leaders in sustainability, is that they think they need to have all of the solution developed. And my advice to people is to just start telling stories as soon as you've got them available, provided it's part of a broader plan and you know where you're headed. Bring people along, be authentic and share your stories as soon as you can. And that applies to leadership. People will follow you for sure if you show your authentic, natural self and have the confidence, even if you're not perfect, to tell some stories. Yeah, I think it's an underrated skill that we all need to do more of.
Yeah, and I like how you talk about the authentic side of things, because I think people can start telling stories, but there's stories in their stories. If you're authentic, that's great because people can see right through if you're not being authentic. But I really like it. So tell stories to build engagement, so engaging people in their imagination. And I know that even when we're kids, or even if those who have got kids, they love to hear stories. And so why? I think it's taking them on that emotional journey, is taking them on a journey. Yeah, and if we can connect people that way, it's fantastic.
You think about in a social situation that the friends or people you meet who are the most interesting for you to be with, they're the ones that are storytellers sitting around the year, or sitting all the social time this time of the year. It's the storytellers that have the people standing around listening to them. It's really cool. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's an art, as Allan's saying, team, and so get really good at it and utilize it. I don't think it will be like within 5 minutes you could probably have it done perfectly. You've got to start somewhere, and as Allan's saying, start telling the story and practice at it, because I think it's a very important skill for sure.
Yeah.
So, Allan, the show is called Leadership is Changing. When I say that title or that statement, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is changing, although it's changing and it's not, I think, in some ways. You hear a lot about the speed of technology and how that's influencing our lives now. Sustainability, obviously, health and safety, especially mental health, are all putting demands on leaders now. Those things are moving much faster. However, I really think the essence of being a leader hasn't changed that much. Connecting with people, caring about them, and I think really caring about people. There's one thing to say it, there's another thing to actually go and talk to people and ask them face to face what matters in your life right now. Really care about them, making the tough calls. We've been able to weed through, this has come through quite a bit for me over my career, being able to weed through the issues and make things simple. If you can get your strategy, I'm a big fan of getting your strategy on one page. And I talk to in the sustainability world people about businesses about creating a framework and a sustainability framework. If you can't tell your story or your strategy or your program in one page, I think you've got to go back and reflect. Connecting with people, really caring, making tough calls, simplifying things. I think that's what really counts, and it will enable you to cope with change really effectively.
Yeah, that's good. And as you're saying, showing that with people is really good, because I think if we can do that really well, to storytelling and being able to help people understand where they're going, communicating really well, that's where you can engage with them. That's when they can act on things and get action happening. And that's when they can commit to the story, to things as we do that. And I know that it's what you do in your business side of things as well, that you take clients through that to make sure they do that for sure, which is really interesting to see. And as you said, there is a lot of stuff changing, but some of it isn't. So there's a lot, probably another way of maybe saying it is there's a lot more focus in different areas. Sustainability is one. And we're talking about the environmental side, but it's also probably sustainability of an organization too. Would that be true?
Yeah. Yeah. People, when you first talk to companies about sustainability, people naturally think about the environmental side of it. But COVID's taught us nothing this year. It's that social sustainability is super critical, right? We do have to take care of the planet. That hasn't gone away. And many companies haven't started on that journey. But the social side of things is really top of mind, which the trauma and that people have been through, and just the anxiety and the demands on mental health. I think it's pretty critical. But I'm also ultimately a commercial guy at heart. And if you don't secure the economic sustainability of the business, then you can't create that ability to do those other things effectively. And actually, I was at the Sustainable Business Awards last week, and we talked a bit about this sort of thing amongst the group. And if you don't secure your economic future, you don't really create a platform to do those other take care of people. So it's about balance these days. It's about getting all three aspects of sustainability balanced, and it hasn't always been like that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leadership is Changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change, inspiring executives and leaders to adapt and lead a bigger game in a fast-moving world.